Democracy's guardrails shattered today in ways that would have been unthinkable just months ago. The Senate Judiciary Committee experienced complete institutional collapse when every Democratic member simultaneously abandoned their posts in unified protest. But here's the constitutional crisis unfolding. Republicans continued conducting official business anyway, potentially violating fundamental Senate rules while advancing Trump's most controversial judicial nominees to lifetime positions. This isn't routine political theater. This is the systematic dismantling of checks and balances in real time. Good evening. What transpired in the Hart Senate office building this afternoon represents an unprecedented breakdown of institutional norms that threatens the constitutional framework itself. The immediate trigger involved two explosive Trump judicial nominations, but the deeper implications expose how quickly democratic institutions can collapse when power supersedes procedure. Chairman Chuck Grassley made a calculated decision that stunned even veteran Senate observers. Without warning, he terminated debate on pending judicial nominees and forced immediate voting despite Democratic objections. When Senator Cory Booker challenged this abrupt procedural shift, stating, "This erodes committee integrity. What are you afraid of?" Grassley simply ignored him and continued calling votes. That's when Democrats made their historic choice. Led by Booker, every Democratic committee member rose from their seats and walked out simultaneously. Empty chairs lined one entire side of the committee room while Republicans proceeded with confirmation votes for nominees they hadn't finished vetting. The nominees at the center of this institutional warfare carry extraordinary conflicts of interest that demand scrutiny. Emil Bove served as Trump's personal criminal defense attorney through multiple felony prosecutions. Jeanine Pirro spent years as a Fox News commentator, promoting conspiracy theories and facing network suspensions for spreading misinformation. Now both seek lifetime federal judgeships with enormous power over American law. But explosive new allegations elevate this beyond typical confirmation politics. A Justice Department whistleblower has come forward with claims that Bove, during his recent DOJ tenure, advised department lawyers to ignore federal court injunctions, specifically orders blocking Trump's mass deportation operations under the controversial Alien Enemies Act. Think about the constitutional implications here. A former Justice Department official allegedly counseled defying federal judicial authority now seeks appointment to that same federal judiciary. Democrats prepared extensive questioning about these whistleblower allegations before casting votes on Bove's lifetime appointment. They never received that opportunity. The sequence of events reveals careful Republican orchestration. Grassley opened proceedings following standard protocols. Democrats began preliminary questioning of both nominees, but within 30 minutes, without procedural warning or motion, Grassley declared debate terminated and called for immediate voting. This violated long-standing Senate traditions that ensure thorough vetting of lifetime judicial appointments. Senators typically spend hours questioning nominees about qualifications, backgrounds, potential conflicts, and controversial allegations. That scrutiny protects judicial independence by ensuring only qualified, impartial candidates receive confirmation. When Democrats attempted to continue their constitutionally mandated oversight role, Grassley simply overruled them. No explanation, no justification, just raw majority power exercised without regard for institutional norms. Senator Booker's response reflected the gravity of this moment. Normally measured and diplomatic, he rose and directly challenged the chairman's unprecedented actions. "This is unjust. This violates Senate rules and constitutional principles. I cannot participate in this mockery of the confirmation process." His departure triggered a cascade effect that stunned Republicans. One by one, every Democratic member followed Booker's lead. Dick Durbin, Amy Klobuchar, Sheldon Whitehouse, Mazie Hirono, all abandoning their constitutional duties rather than legitimize what they viewed as a fundamental assault on Senate procedures. The sight was unprecedented in modern Senate history. Empty Democratic seats facing Republican members who continued voting as if institutional collapse was merely routine business. But here's where legal questions become critical. Senate rules require a quorum, minimum member presence, for legitimate committee business. When Democrats withdrew en masse, serious questions emerged about whether Republicans retained sufficient members for legally binding votes. Republicans proceeded anyway, advancing both nominees to full Senate consideration despite questionable procedural legitimacy. This establishes dangerous precedent that majority parties can simply ignore minority participation when convenient. Such precedents outlast individual politicians and permanently reshape institutional behavior in ways that threaten democratic governance itself. Now let's examine the specific nominees whose controversial backgrounds triggered this institutional crisis, because understanding their qualifications reveals why Democrats viewed Grassley's procedural shortcuts as so dangerous for judicial independence. Emil Bove represents perhaps Trump's most problematic judicial selection yet. Before his recent Justice Department stint, Bove served as Trump's criminal defense attorney through multiple high-stakes prosecutions. The Manhattan hush money trial, classified documents case, January 6th conspiracy charges, Bove defended Trump against federal accusations that could have resulted in imprisonment. Now Trump wants his former defense lawyer elevated to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, one of America's most influential appellate courts, for life. The obvious conflict involves future cases affecting Trump that might reach the Third Circuit. Can Bove impartially adjudicate matters involving his former client who appointed him? Democrats argue the answer is unequivocally no, but recent whistleblower allegations add explosive new dimensions to Bove's problematic nomination. According to a career Justice Department official who came forward, Bove allegedly advised DOJ lawyers to ignore federal court injunctions blocking Trump's immigration enforcement operations. Specifically, court orders issued by federal judges who determined Trump's mass deportation plans violated constitutional due process requirements. The whistleblower claims Bove's response was essentially ignore judicial interference, proceed with deportations regardless of court orders. If accurate, this represents a judicial nominee who allegedly counseled defying the very judicial authority he now seeks to exercise. Democrats viewed such conduct as absolutely disqualifying for any federal court position. 900 former Justice Department officials apparently agree. They signed unprecedented opposition letters regarding Bove's nomination. Career prosecutors from both Republican and Democratic administrations unified in institutional concern about his qualifications. These aren't partisan political operatives. They're serious legal professionals who dedicated careers to Justice Department service under multiple presidents. Their collective message, Bove's recent conduct, renders him unsuitable for judicial appointment. Democrats want a detailed examination of these serious allegations. They prepared comprehensive questioning about Bove's Justice Department tenure, his advice regarding court orders, his views on executive power versus judicial authority. Such scrutiny represents standard confirmation procedure for lifetime appointments carrying enormous constitutional significance. Senators routinely spend entire days questioning nominees about far less controversial matters. But Grassley prevented this examination entirely, terminating debate before Democrats could explore the whistleblower allegations or the unprecedented professional opposition to Bove's nomination. Then there's Jeanine Pirro, whose background presents entirely different but equally troubling qualifications issues. A former prosecutor turned Fox News personality, Pirro spent recent years as one of Trump's most vocal media champions. She promoted election fraud conspiracies, viciously attacked Trump critics, and faced multiple network suspensions for spreading demonstrable misinformation. Now Trump seeks to reward this media loyalty with lifetime federal court appointment. Democrats see this nomination as fundamentally corrupt. presidential reward for propaganda services rather than judicial qualification assessment. They prepared questioning about Pirro's inflammatory public statements, conspiracy theory promotion, and obvious bias toward Trump in potential future cases. Again, Grassley prevented thorough examination of these legitimate qualification concerns. The procedural breakdown reveals Trump's broader judicial strategy that extends far beyond these specific controversial nominees. Rather than nominating qualified conservatives through normal confirmation processes, he's systematically selecting personal loyalists and forcing rapid confirmation without meaningful oversight. This threatens the fundamental principle of judicial independence. Courts function as constitutional checks on executive power only when judges maintain genuine impartiality toward those who appointed them. Personal loyalty relationships completely undermine that independence. Consider the emerging pattern. Trump consistently nominates individuals with direct personal connections rather than purely professional qualifications. Former personal attorneys, television defenders, political allies, selections that prioritize loyalty over traditional judicial independence principles. The immigration enforcement angle cannot be ignored either. Those alleged court order violations directly connect to Trump's aggressive deportation expansion plans. Federal judges across the political spectrum have repeatedly issued injunctions blocking enforcement actions that violate constitutional due process requirements. Trump's apparent strategy involves packing courts with judges who will defer to presidential authority and provide maximum flexibility for immigration enforcement without judicial interference. If he places enough loyal judges throughout the federal system, he can effectively neutralize judicial oversight of executive actions. This extends beyond immigration to every major policy area. Environmental regulations, labor rights, corporate accountability, voting rights, reproductive freedom, gun regulations, every significant political debate eventually reaches federal courts. Whoever controls judicial appointments controls the long-term direction of American law and society. Trump clearly understands this dynamic, which explains why Republicans are willing to shatter institutional norms to rush controversial confirmations. The committee breakdown also reflects broader institutional erosion accelerating throughout Trump's second term. Senate norms that maintained bipartisan cooperation for generations are disintegrating with alarming speed. Confirmation hearings traditionally involve extensive bipartisan examination, regardless of nominee ideology. Even ideologically conservative nominees receive thorough Democratic questioning, while liberal nominees face rigorous Republican scrutiny. This system ensures qualified appointments through comprehensive vetting. But when majority parties can terminate debate and force immediate votes, minority input becomes meaningless. The constitutional advice and consent function assigned to the entire Senate gets reduced to majority party rubber stamping. Republicans defend their actions by claiming Democrats have been systematically obstructionist throughout Trump's second term. They argue extended questioning represents delay tactics rather than legitimate constitutional oversight. Some validity exists in this position. Democrats have indeed attempted to slow Trump's judicial confirmations wherever procedurally possible, but that represents their constitutional role as the minority party, providing thorough scrutiny and raising legitimate concerns about controversial nominees. The critical distinction separates obstruction from oversight. Asking detailed questions about serious whistleblower allegations isn't obstruction. It's essential due diligence for lifetime appointments carrying enormous governmental authority. And that authority is genuinely enormous. Federal appellate judges, like the position Bove seeks control, appeals affecting millions of Americans. They interpret constitutional rights, resolve federal law conflicts, and check governmental overreach. District judges, like Pirro's targeted position, wield similar authority over individual cases that establish binding legal precedents. These aren't symbolic appointments. They're lifetime positions that will influence American jurisprudence for decades beyond Trump's presidency. Moving forward, both nominations advance to full Senate consideration, where the real political battle begins. Democrats will attempt every available parliamentary maneuver, procedural delays, recorded votes, public pressure campaigns targeting vulnerable Republicans. They'll emphasize the procedural breakdown, the whistleblower allegations, the unprecedented professional opposition from Justice Department veterans. They'll argue that confirming such controversial nominees without proper vetting fundamentally undermines judicial legitimacy. Republicans will likely maintain party unity and confirm both nominees. They view judicial appointments as generational conservative victories that justify short-term political costs and institutional damage. But the precedent being established extends far beyond these specific confirmations. Future majority parties will reference today's procedures when expediting their own controversial judicial selections. Institutional guardrails, once shattered, rarely restore themselves. This represents more than typical Washington procedural disputes. American judicial independence depends entirely on confirmation processes that ensure qualified, impartial judges receive lifetime tenure. When political loyalty supersedes professional qualifications, courts risk becoming governmental extensions rather than constitutional checks. The broader implications are genuinely staggering. If Trump successfully places sufficient loyal judges throughout the federal system, he can effectively eliminate judicial oversight of executive actions. Mass deportations, regulatory elimination, voting restrictions, environmental rollbacks all become much easier to implement when friendly judges control the courts. Democrats understand this dynamic completely. That explains why they're fighting so desperately, despite lacking votes to prevent confirmations. They're attempting to preserve institutional norms before they collapse entirely. The 2026 midterm implications cannot be ignored. Democrats will absolutely campaign on today's institutional breakdown. Their message? Republicans violated Senate rules, rushed unqualified nominees, and systematically destroyed judicial independence. Vote Democratic to restore constitutional checks and balances. This represents powerful messaging for voters concerned about institutional norms, constitutional governance, and rule of law principles. Significant numbers of independents, moderate Republicans, and traditional conservatives remain deeply uncomfortable with Trump's norm-breaking behavior. Democrats are calculating that judicial fights will motivate these voters, crystallize concerns about authoritarian tendencies, and drive turnout in competitive states. Republicans are making the opposite calculation. They're betting their base prioritizes conservative judicial outcomes over procedural niceties, that voters will reward them for delivering ideologically favorable judges, regardless of confirmation controversies. We won't know which calculation proves correct until the midterms. But today's walkout will absolutely become a major campaign issue that shapes voter perceptions of Trump's second term and Republican governance. Whether you support Trump's broader agenda or oppose it, institutional degradation threatens everyone's future rights under law. Today's committee breakdown demonstrates how quickly democratic norms collapse when power calculations override procedural integrity. This is how democracies decline, not through dramatic coups, but through incremental norm violations that gradually erode self-governance foundations. When majority parties can ignore minorities, rush appointments without scrutiny, and break rules without consequences, constitutional government becomes impossible. The precedent being established that institutional norms are optional, that procedures matter less than power, that loyalty trumps qualifications, will outlast Trump's presidency and fundamentally alter how American government functions. Once we normalize this behavior, returning to constitutional governance becomes extraordinarily difficult. Trust in institutions takes generations to build, but disappears overnight when politicians prioritize partisan victories over institutional preservation. We're witnessing that institutional collapse in real time. The question remaining is whether sufficient Americans care about constitutional governance to demand accountability from their representatives. This story continues developing as both nominations advance through final confirmation stages. The implications will resonate for decades beyond current political battles. The constitutional mechanics underlying today's breakdown deserve careful examination. Senate rules governing judicial confirmations evolved over decades to balance majority party prerogatives with minority party oversight responsibilities. These procedures weren't arbitrary bureaucratic inventions. They reflected hard-won compromises designed to ensure lifetime judicial appointments receive adequate scrutiny while preventing minority obstruction of qualified nominees. When Chairman Grassley terminated debate without warning, he violated this careful balance in unprecedented ways. Previous committee chairs, even during intensely partisan periods, maintained basic procedural fairness standards. The comparison to historical confirmation battles proves instructive. During Robert Bork's 1987 nomination fight, despite fierce ideological disagreement, Senate Democrats never attempted to simply end questioning periods. They fought Bork's confirmation through extensive hearings that examined his judicial philosophy thoroughly. Similarly, Republicans' opposition to Merrick Garland involved refusing to hold hearings entirely rather than conducting sham hearings with inadequate examination time. Both tactics proved controversial but respected institutional boundaries that today's breakdown completely shattered. What makes today's procedural violations particularly dangerous is their potential for normalization. If majority parties can simply terminate minority questioning whenever convenient, the advice and consent function becomes meaningless. Future Democratic majorities will face enormous pressure to employ identical tactics when Republicans raise legitimate concerns about controversial liberal nominees. The institutional spiral becomes inevitable. The international implications cannot be ignored either. America's global influence depends partly on demonstrating functional democratic institutions that other nations might emulate. When American institutional norms collapse in ways that mirror authoritarian systems, majority rule without minority rights, loyalty-based appointments, procedural shortcuts, America's credibility as a democratic model suffers irreparable damage. European allies have privately expressed concerns about American institutional stability under Trump's second term. Today's confirmation breakdown will likely reinforce those concerns and complicate diplomatic relationships. China and Russia regularly cite American institutional problems to deflect criticism of their authoritarian practices. The Senate walkout provides new ammunition for such deflection strategies, undermining American efforts to promote democracy globally. But immediate domestic consequences remain most significant. The federal judiciary will spend decades grappling with the legitimacy questions raised by today's procedural breakdown. If judges confirmed through illegitimate processes issue controversial rulings, their decisions face heightened challenges to their authority. Legal compliance depends partly on public acceptance of judicial legitimacy. When that legitimacy erodes through politicized confirmation processes, courts lose their ability to resolve constitutional disputes effectively. The result is institutional breakdown that threatens democratic governance itself. Reform proposals exist, but face substantial implementation obstacles. Ideas include mandatory minimum debate periods for judicial nominees, supermajority requirements for lifetime appointments, or constitutional amendments establishing judicial term limits. Such reforms require either constitutional amendments or bipartisan cooperation that seems increasingly impossible given current political polarization levels. The more realistic scenario involves continued norm erosion until judicial confirmations become purely partisan exercises divorced from qualification assessments. This outcome threatens judicial independence more fundamentally than any specific controversial nominee. Meanwhile, political mobilization around judicial appointments reaches unprecedented levels. Progressive organizations view today's breakdown as evidence supporting their arguments about Republican authoritarianism. Labor unions, environmental groups, civil rights organizations, and women's rights advocates have unified behind opposition to both nominees. Their combined political resources represent significant pressure on vulnerable Republicans in competitive states. Democratic fundraising spiked dramatically following the committee walkout, suggesting powerful base reactions to procedural violations. Small dollar donations increased by 300% within hours of news coverage, indicating grassroots anger about institutional breakdown. But Republicans possess mobilization advantages too. Conservative legal organizations like the Federalist Society view judicial appointments as their highest political priority. These groups maintain substantial financial resources and grassroots networks dedicated specifically to confirming conservative judges. They'll likely match or exceed Democratic spending on confirmation battles. Religious conservative organizations also prioritize judicial appointments above most other political issues. Their mobilization capabilities proved decisive in Trump's 2024 electoral victory and remain formidable political forces. The result will be unprecedented political warfare over judicial appointments extending far beyond traditional Washington insider politics. Local media markets in competitive states will face saturation advertising about specific nominees. Citizens who normally ignore Senate procedural disputes will encounter intensive pressure campaigns demanding they contact representatives about confirmation votes. This politicization threatens judicial independence by making judges campaign issues rather than legal professionals. The feedback loops between political mobilization and institutional breakdown create dangerous dynamics. As judicial appointments become more politicized, public confidence in judicial independence declines accordingly. This declining confidence encourages political leaders to treat courts as partisan institutions rather than neutral arbiters, creating further pressure for loyalty-based appointments over merit-based selections. The constitutional crisis thus becomes self-perpetuating. Each violation of confirmation norms justifies additional violations until procedural safeguards disappear entirely. Historical precedents suggest both optimistic and pessimistic scenarios for institutional recovery. Previous periods of intense political polarization have sometimes produced eventual reconciliation and norm restoration. But other historical examples demonstrate how quickly democratic institutions can collapse when political leaders prioritize short-term victories over long-term institutional preservation. The choice belongs to current politicians and voters. Whether American democracy emerges stronger or weaker depends on decisions being made in Senate offices and voting booths across the country. Today's committee walkout represents a crucial inflection point whose resolution will determine the trajectory of American constitutional government for generations. The direction chosen now will determine whether future Americans inherit functional democratic institutions or the constitutional rubble of a failed republic. Stay tuned as this constitutional crisis continues unfolding with consequences that will resonate for generations.